Our CIGH team thought very long and hard about who would be an inspirational, large thinker, visionary person to give our keynote address. So it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Diana Chapman Walsh, who is the 12th president of Wellesley College and is a recognized leader in higher education. Her presidency from 1993 to 2007 was marked by educational innovation, including a revision of the typical curriculum in a college education, expanded programs in global education, the humanities, internships, and service learning, as well as interdisciplinary teaching and learning. And prior to her Wellesley presidency, Diana was at the Harvard School of Public Health, where she chaired the Department of Health and Social Behavior. She currently serves on so many governing boards, it's hard to keep straight, but the ones that are pertinent for here, the Kaiser Family Foundation, the MIT Broad Institute, and actually where she chaired that institute. And also, interestingly, the Mind and Life Institute, where she sort of works very closely with the Dalai Lama. She's published and spoken widely on public health and higher education. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and she's also a member of the Center for Innovation in Global Health, Climate Change and Health Initiative. Diana, please come to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks to Lloyd and Chris for the wonderful opening remarks. They set the stage very well for what I want to say to you, so that's great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. You're a welcome sight, all of you out there. From my vantage point here, of course, the front row is empty, as front rows always are, except for Michelle and my husband. I'm very conscious, as the dean said and as Chris Field said, I'm very conscious of the sense of promise that's gathered here in this space. I took a little tour quickly through the posters that are there, so many interesting and different topics. How much passion there is in this room to improve the world, how much positive energy. It's going to be a great day. I think my husband Chris was at the dinner last night, the event last night, and said the energy was just exciting and wonderful. So I'm supposed to look there, and I don't have to look around back. As a newcomer to this center, I want to extend a special welcome to others today who may be relatively new, if you're here in the audience, taking a first deep dive, maybe, from elsewhere in the university, and especially to those, and I look out and see that you are here, those who represent upcoming generations, the younger among us, the women, got a good sampling of that, the people of color, the people from abroad. From where I stand, it's you who are pointing, and we may hope pushing, those of us who've been around for quite a while, toward a truer, more nuanced, and more sensitive and fully alive future. Every one of you brings a piece of a large and intricate puzzle, as Chris just said so clearly. And it's an ever-shifting one. It's the hope, I know, of this center and the organizers who've worked hard on this event that you'll come to value and count upon the relationships that you form here as the center continues to evolve and grow. That this center will be a place that shapes thinking, sculpts careers, deepens values, broadens experiences, fosters connections and collaborations, in short, engages all its members fully, mind and heart, in a community that will be a touchstone for your work and for your lives in the years ahead. So today you have an opportunity to hear about individual research projects from a variety of disciplines and in a variety of formats, these quick delivery formats and more extended ones. And these are projects that in time are likely to influence and perhaps become integral to the larger weave of this center's fabric of common ambition and ultimate influence. Although this is my first official encounter with the center as a member, I recognize in it elements of organizations I've known quite well, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, Wellesley College, the Kaiser Family Foundation, and others, as Michelle said. I want to pause for a moment on the one that's farthest afield from you, I think, way out in left field, truly, we might say, although it's on the top right side of the slide. I want to speak a bit of the Mind and Life Institute. It was founded with the Dalai Lama in 1987 to initiate a critical dialogue between the first and second person inquiry, developed and refined over some 2,500 years of Eastern contemplative traditions, arguably a form of mind science and a very well-documented one in Sanskrit, and the third-person investigations of Western brain scientists, anticipating at that time what we now know as high-tech, interdisciplinary, big data, neuroscientific research of the sort that's being carried out at the Broad Institute, at its Stanley Center, and at many other places here too as well, of course. Mind and Life gatherings over the past 30 years have spanned disciplines from the mind sciences to the social and medical sciences to contemplative scholarship, education, and practice. This is a poster from a 5-day meeting in Dharamsala, India. You can see the mountains that I co-moderated with others and the Dalai Lama. Importantly, philosophers and humanists have been part of the enterprise too, bringing context and critical perspective, asking the eternal questions, challenging claims that may have been too exuberant, slowing timetables that may have been too rushed. There's a tension, and it's a fruitful one, I believe, between, on the one hand, a sincere eagerness to spread knowledge that seems life-enhancing, and on the other, a healthy skepticism about what we actually know and how well we know it. At that intersection lie deeper mysteries about what is and isn't ours to know, as the dean just said, as well as questions of when and where further science will narrow uncertainties on timescales that matter. Such questions are as salient for us here today, I think, as they were for Mind and Life from its beginning 30 years ago, when its co-founder, who was a neuroscientist with the Dalai Lama, described the dialogues as a way to help elucidate the workings of the human mind. This would be, he said, quote, both for the benefit of the world and for our own individual interests as scientists. Here then is a split-screen focus I'd like to invite you to consider as both inspiration and challenge. The impulse, on the one hand, to reach out with impatience and vigor to serve the world, and on the other, to turn inward, to wonder, listen, learn, and replenish. I raise this because the threats of global health strike me as so urgent, so massive, often literally heartbreaking, that I'm betting that the dangers of burnout loom especially large for many of you. Mind and Life has contemplative practice at the core of its research agenda, an intrinsic balance of inner and outer. And so I'd pose to you a question that was put to me and Michelle more than 30 years ago when we first became friends through a 3-year Kellogg Fellowship. A scholar named Parker Palmer asked us this question, which he drew from a teaching story entitled The Woodcarver by a Chinese Taoist philosopher from the 4th century BCE, Xuanzhu, translated in 1969 by the Trappist monk and poet Thomas Merton in this book you see. It's the story of a master carver whom the prince commands, so already the stakes are high, to make a bell stand, a stand to hold the bell that they use in services. When the carver presents the finished stand to the court, all are amazed at its beauty. It must be the work of spirits, they exclaim, raising the stakes even higher. What is your secret? The prince demands. The woodcarver replies, I am only a workman. I have no secret. There is only this. When I began to think about the work you commanded, I guarded my spirit, did not expend it on trifles that were not to the point. I fasted in order to set my heart at rest. After 7 days, all thought of your highness and the court had faded away. Then I went into the forest to see the trees in their natural state. When the right tree appeared before my eyes, the bell stand appeared in it, clearly beyond doubt. What happened? My own collected thought encountered the hidden potential in the wood. From this live encounter came the work which you ascribe to the spirits. Well, there's much to find in this story, including an appreciation of hidden potential, live encounter, and what Parker calls the work before the work. But the question he put to us, and the one I pass along to you, not for us to answer today, but for you to take with you and carry along as Michelle and I did all those years ago, is this. How do you guard your spirit amid all the projections and stresses, the uncertainties and expectations coming at you from a sometimes harsh and demanding world? Here, to symbolize that question, is a gorgeous image from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation at the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that's one aspect of a tension between inner and outer, between thought and action. A second arises in the long-standing debate about the relative merits of basic and applied research, where, when, and how to invest in translational studies, how to define them, where they begin and end. The answer there has generally taken the form of a kind of middle way, transcending the surface contradiction between deeper knowledge and more immediate impact, on an understanding that the two approaches actually enrich each other. So we have university presidents arguing for continued investment in fundamental, basic research, because without it, we're unlikely to solve humanity's grand challenges. This is the president of MIT in a recent op-ed piece. And as well, we have scientists arguing for revisions in the social compact between researchers and society. The calls for a new social contract have at least two elements. This imperative, to focus on what truly matters, to focus on important problems, is hardly new for global health. You've always been about finding and addressing the high-impact problems. You have your familiar 17 Sustainable Development Goals as targets, and before that, the MDGs. You have frameworks from the CDC and WHO, many catalogs of research priorities in global health. And now, from the 2015 Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission, we have the call to expand public health to planetary health defined as the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which civilization depends. And Chris alluded to that. So you've got focus and you've got breadth. A second aspect of the question of science's social compact moves beyond what problems scientists choose to study to how they choose to study them. Excuse me. Research on planetary health is much broader vision, calls that question because solutions to environmental challenges will require everyone's participation. We're all part of the problem and part of the solution. And because successful adaptation to environmental crises will require a resilience at the individual, family, and community level, at the social level, that we currently lack and desperately need. And so we need education and involvement that are meaningful and motivating in the research we do, that are transparent and open to influence, honest about uncertainty. Susie Mosier here is a friend and a fellow of the Woods Institute who writes and speaks thoughtfully on these questions of responsive, interactive, transdisciplinary science for knowledge that is not just reliable, but also socially robust. The world of research is changing because the world is changing rapidly. Here, then, from a well-known MIT entity, the Media Laboratory, the Media Lab, which is led now by Joey Ito, and the photo and the cover of his new book, Whiplash, which makes an interesting case for new kinds of research organizations to foster creativity and innovation in our times that are changing. Since innovation is your center's middle name, let's take a look at his propositions. A need for new habits of mind in the digital age. A need to see emergence from distributed networks as the source of new knowledge, rather than expecting much from old-style, centralized, linear strategic planning. The need to see change as constant, not episodic, and to value mistakes for the lessons they teach, the entrepreneur's credo, fail early and often to lead. Seem to be, there we go, okay. These are a few of the conditions that Joey sees as making it possible to imagine a new culture of emergent innovation that he describes. And they're really conditions that create this situation of very low-cost connectivity that's enabled in the network age across the globe. And his understanding of his role as the Media Lab's director, tending a garden, a self-adapting ecosystem rather than trying to control or drive or manage a clunky analog age machine, opening the way to something beautiful and new. Joey's vision is similar to the ways in which Eric Lander leads the Broad Institute, another wellspring of creative and innovative research. I chaired the Broad's inaugural board, as Michelle said, and I saw firsthand that for all its scientific virtuosity, which is truly impressive, the Broad is as remarkable for its organizational design, for the how of the research that it does as an integral part of what it accomplishes. This experimental spirit in the design of the Broad was part of its DNA from the start. So here we have a visual image that conveys one essential element of what's new, the move away from hierarchy to elegant and delicate balancing of interdependent parts. As a newcomer to Stanford, I don't have the lay of the land here yet, but I do know for sure that there are as many or more innovative models out here in the Silicon Valley advancing the same kinds of entrepreneurial spirit as those that I know and have encountered directly back east. So this is my first message to you, a few observations from organizations a continent away. The message is simply this. First, that the world is changing, in case we hadn't noticed, that the change is constant, it isn't going to stop, that it's disruptive and often disorienting, as we experience all the time, but that it is also intriguing, and especially so in the opportunities it may offer for new ways of working together. Working together in inventive and enlivening collaborations that are fluid and fulfilling and fun and lively, and even do point to ways we can guard our spirits at times of uncertainty and complexity. So now I want to shift to the West Coast, to the here and now, the right here and now, and reflect with you a bit on some questions that have been on my mind. The most pressing for me at this moment have arisen out of the recent presidential election. This is inauguration week, as we all know, and its impact on work I was pursuing that I thought was on a path that I could at least dimly see. Now I find myself questioning how best to deploy myself, where and how to engage my energies in service of a safer, saner world. And I would guess that some of you have been asking yourselves similar questions. As a distraction, if you haven't already, you'll want to see The Eagle Huntress. It's playing locally, an engaging documentary film about a 13-year-old Mongolian girl who became the first ever eagle huntress in a culture that had always reserved this coveted role for men. It's a great film. You may notice that this isn't a 13-year-old Mongolian girl. It's here to remind me that your fearless leader enjoys a risk. She's shaking her head. Michelle assured me that it would be okay for me to be political, as she put it, in this time with you. So I will be really blunt and say this. I'm convinced that white supremacy and patriarchy played a role in setting the course and shaping the result of the 2016 election. And I'm worried that those results may bode poorly for the future of life as we know it on this planet, which was already in some peril, and that the reason for that peril is in large part the white supremacy and patriarchy and their corollaries, empire and unfettered capitalism, systems of thought and action that have brought us to a crisis point. Phew, I said it. An indictment of pretty much everything, an echo of Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, her book about climate change. A kind of dark view, maybe to counter in some part Joey Ito's techno-optimism, which we most certainly need, and the example of the mosquito tweets is a wonderful reminder that technology has many answers for us and it needs to advance and change the world. But even as that happens, even as technological breakthroughs continue to emerge, there do remain legitimate doubts about whether the systems that have brought us to the brink of disaster are the ones that will carry us through. We're in a world of complexity now of interacting systems, physical, social, economic, political, as Chris just said. Here's another systems perspective with an optimistic title, America the Possible, but a deeply critical view of our current predicament. James Gustav Speth, a consummate insider, as he's been called, for the many posts, sort of like Chris Fields, that he's held in government and academia, including at Yale, an establishment progressive, and in no sense a radical, except that he's naming a reality that many vested interests have labored to keep under wraps. A virulent, fast-growing strain of corporate consumerist capitalism, the basic operating system of our society, rewarding profit, growth, and power at the expense of people, place, and planet, creating a world of wounds. This is from his 2012 book, America the Possible, 2012, 5 years ago. So it's not that anything really changed in the early hours of 11/9, Election Day, the next morning, with its echoes of 9/11, even though many of us were swept up in the overconfidence of the pollsters and the media, as I surely was, those of us living in these bubbles that we love. We have, many of us, long been seeing and feeling the very deep fissures that Bernie Sanders did tap into. Now we have a president-elect who brings them out into bold relief. It's almost a caricature. It's sort of beyond belief. And that was captured succinctly, I think, in this tweet that anticipated his victory. Things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. So what does this mean for your work and for mine? I've been especially concerned of late about the damage we're doing the environment, about climate change. The cabinet nominees for state, EPA, energy, and interior are certainly not reassuring. I keep calling my senators, my two senators, our two senators, and telling them that, but of course they already know it. Here from the Kaiser Family Foundation's News Bureau is a headline to grab our attention. This happens to be a reference to the 2016 UN report on food security, and it's one of a great many sources we could cite on climate change and the threat it poses to increase world poverty. The prospect of 122 million people falling back into extreme poverty by 2030 because of climate change. For a field whose fundamental task is to lift people out of poverty, numbers like this are familiar and alarming, I'm sure. The hard-won progress your field has made is at risk of being reversed by the irreparable damage we humans are doing to the Earth's natural systems. After I left Wellesley in 2007, I set out to educate myself on climate change. It hadn't been my focus before then particularly, although I'd been watching it from the periphery, and to see if there might be a role I could find that would be in some way constructive. My seat on the MIT Executive Committee, of course, gave me a close-in perspective on scientific and technological possibilities. For a different view, I joined a colleague and a friend who was the director then of Clark University's Humanities Center, and we convened a circle of 12 women, scientists, artists, and scholars, who made a commitment to spend time together, significant time, to get real about the climate crisis and inquire what it asks of us. Calling ourselves a council on the uncertain human future, We explored what's known and not known about climate change and asked about implications. We opened to the emotion beneath what the scientists and artists are seeing, and in the wisdom and connection of the circle, in the depths we were able to discover in ourselves and one another. We began to emerge, each of us, with a clearer picture of who it is we can be in this emergency and what it is we can bring to it. We asked these 3 questions. I've come out of that ongoing process since about 2012, feeling strongly that we do face an emergency. Here's mild-mannered Gus Speth again, encapsulating the essence of what I learned in the council. If we don't change course, and soon, we are in deep trouble. He's done some of the most convincing writing on the need for transformative change and has become a spokesperson for what he calls a next systems project that's working on a vision of a new economy centered around the values that have been lacking in the current system. From Juliet Shore's book, Planitude, this is a neat summary of some of the values that are missing, imagining a future that many of us could want, to work and spend less, create and connect more, emit and despoil less, enjoy and thrive more. Kind of sums it up. The experience of the council made it clear to me that I couldn't look away from this problem, so I read everything I could, but of course only scratched the surface. Took a few online courses and started weaving themes about climate instability into every speech I gave. I learned and taught a world climate simulation developed at MIT, a role-playing exercise that gives participants a sense of the dynamics of the UN climate negotiations. We led that for about 100 people over a week at a leadership institute in August of 2014, and those of us who were involved saw the Paris conference that December in a whole new light. The outcome of Paris was a relief in many ways. We knew it was only a start, that it remained to be seen whether the world's leaders could and would muster the political will to reverse trends that are propelling us into the unknown. But it was an important step forward, yielding greater agreement among diverse nations about what's fair, critical step, and greater confidence in global governance as a way forward together. All of this, of course, was before the presidential election, before the advent of Trump and his cabinet choices. Before the election, on the national level, we had increasingly earnest and effective presidential leadership, increasingly powerful, and the prospect of more of that, we thought. And it was in this connection that I was drawn into the work of this center. When David Hayes, the organizer of this interdisciplinary endeavor at Stanford, invited Michelle to prepare a briefing paper for the next administration on climate change in health, she invited me to join her, and she, Kathy Burke, and I immersed ourselves in a substantial literature and wrote a paper that's online if you're interested. We came to see health as the human face of climate change, and climate change as the ultimate global health crisis. Our boldest and most creative recommendation was for a president's emergency response to climate change. We called it PERC, a 10-year, $90 billion initiative modeled after PEPFAR, housed in the State Department because climate change is so central to global health and security, indeed all security, and because the health agencies and the federal government needed a push. We thought we were on a roll. We had an op-ed ready for submission the next day after the election, but it, along with so much else, became moot in the early hours of 11/9. Still, all is not lost. It's the federal level that's utterly up for grabs right now, but there's ample action elsewhere, and the science continues to move us in the right direction, and that's, of course, where you come in. Chris Fields and Catherine Mock did a terrific paper, and it too is online, you may want to read it, for that same Stanford project, summarizing significant changes in just the 2 years since the 2014 IPCC report, in which Chris played a central role. In a way, this is a reply to the emergency slide a minute ago that said we're doomed if we keep on doing what we're doing. This paper shows how dynamic the situation is, how much we continue to learn, and how that learning expands our options. The last 3 bullet points on this slide lead to the conclusion, Chris's conclusion, that in just 2 years, scientific findings have materially improved the world's ability to respond to climate change. encouraging news for the next president if he should choose to listen. If he doesn't, then beneath the federal level, there's dynamism in the states. California, of course, has been a guiding light and a learning laboratory. We're very lucky to be here for all kinds of reasons. You may have heard Jerry Brown pledging in his fiery speech to the American Geophysics Union last month that he will resist the new administration, if need be, in every way. We have the scientists, he said, and we have the lawyers. We're prepared to fight. If the administration cuts the budget for satellites, we'll launch our own. He joked that he'd wanted to launch one as a young governor years ago, which is how he got the nickname Governor Moonbeam. I earned it, he said. So there's the state level with much potential for forward motion and for experimentation. In local communities across the country and all over the world, there are many, many small-scale experiments demonstrating the feasibility of systemic changes that affirm and sustain life in the ways that Gus Speth and Juliet Schor encouraged, working and spending less, enjoying and thriving more. This is a French documentary film celebrating that spirit. Liz Hadley and her husband, Tony Barnosky, authors of Tipping Point for Planet Earth, introduced the film and played a role in its creation. Liz, of course, is a senior fellow here and at the Woods Institute. She and Tony have recently taken up the leadership of Stanford's Jasper Ridge Biological Reserve. She's a tremendous resource and somebody to bring into our thinking. This film, Demain, tomorrow in French, of course, visits successful initiatives in 10 countries around the world, showing very concrete examples of solutions in agriculture, in energy, in the economy, in education, in governance. Ideas that we can adapt, advance, and study. For those models to spread farther and faster, though, we need wider awareness of the challenges. It's not as though we haven't been warned. This was the first official warning to Congress. Jim Hanson's invited testimony in 1988 to a Senate commission. Many, many others, of course, have followed. Along the way, the climate issue became politicized, and not by accident, as Jane Mayer documents painstakingly in her book, Dark Money. Quite a chilling account of why and how the repeated calls to action on climate change are so often deflected. But what if the recent election turns out to be a political tipping point? What if growing numbers come to see the planetary tipping points, the stakes of inaction, more vividly through the extremism of the incoming administration? What if large numbers of citizens mobilize to demand bold action against the continued destruction of the planet? For that to occur, the first and perhaps the hardest thing we need to do is face reality. The Council experience taught me that venturing deeply into the climate crisis requires equally deep reservoirs of trust. It's a painful journey. That trust is built as people take the time to voice their worries and to be heard by others who take time to listen them into speech, as they discover creative choices they can make and how they choose to live their lives. So what creative choices remain for us in the face of climate change? One of the first is how much of the reality to allow in and how to hold it. Not alone, never alone. Kathleen Dean Moore, a philosopher and a member of this council who speaks and writes incessantly, prolifically to raise the alarm, said she's asked by someone in the audience at pretty much every appearance, what can one person do? Kathy's reply, stop being one person. Here are two more of the council members out doing their things. Gretel Ehrlich, a nature, travel, and science writer, has become the reluctant and eloquent witness to catastrophes around the world. In Greenland, as the melting ice has destroyed a whole way of life. In Japan, where the tsunami has left gaping wounds. And Camille Seaman, a photographer who uses portraiture to capture icebergs, clouds, wild storms. As an American of both African and Native ancestry, she speaks with special poignance about our status as one fragile species in an ephemeral world. Her work and her words are haunting. how much of this to take in? Always the question. Every one of you is advancing good and important work of your own. Why ask you to assume the additional risks of getting real about planetary health? Well, one reason is that your work, the work of global health, entails exactly the kinds of risks that more of us will have to be willing to take if we as a species are to successfully confront the climate crisis. The risk you take routinely is to tell the truth, to begin, as public health researchers do, with an unblinking look at the underlying causes of preventable suffering and an honest effort to understand the systems that continue to thwart efforts to right undeniable wrongs. You don't have the luxury of looking away from the social injustices, the unequal distribution of wealth, stability, and power, the racism and the sexism and the xenophobia that transmit down through the generations disparities in resources, in opportunities, in well-being, in health, in years of life. Decades ago at the Harvard School of Public Health, I founded and led a program called Society in Health. We saw that if we tried to cordon off our micro-level studies from the larger structure realities, our temporary palliatives would likely buttress a toxic status quo. Since those days, I've spent much of my professional life thinking about higher education as itself a system. So I want to end there with attention for universities that has implications for your center as it evolves. It harks back to the new research paradigms at the Media Center, the Broad, and elsewhere, and points forward to our question of how we guard our spirits. On the one hand, institutions of higher learning have a vital role to play in sustaining cultural values of critical thinking, intellectual engagement, respect for evidence, appreciation of the life of the mind, attitudes that are fast losing their toehold in a polarized, wired, buzzing world of irony and disengagement. We certainly saw the effects of that in the recent election. On the other hand, it's past time for academia to be transforming aspects of its own culture that are counterproductive, given the challenges that we face, deep-seated tendencies to isolate and fragment when we need cooperation and integration, to separate mind and heart when we need depths of wisdom and compassion to expand our circles of concern and guide us through tumultuous times. As with so many of our social institutions, universities are engaged in a delicate balancing act. I chose this heartbreaking image to echo Camille's iceberg theme, and also because my brother is a loyal alumnus of Bowdoin College, whose mascot is the polar bear. Academic culture over the years has become an extension of the Western individualism and competition spreading across the globe. But in reality, as we're learning about so much of life, relationships reside at the heart of most scholarship and at the heart of teaching and learning. It's when someone else sees us in our full potential, bears witness to that capacity, appreciates it in us, it's then that we begin to trust it in ourselves. And this is the beginning of learning. Before we see, we must be seen. We learn when we can discover within ourselves the depths that only then we can detect in others, the fullness of who they are, their unconditional worth. This discovery, in turn, reinforces an evolution in consciousness the human species is starting to make, from tribalism and hubristic independence to awareness of our inescapable intertwining with all of life on Earth. Another council member, Mary Evelyn Tucker, and her colleagues at Yale have been tracking this shift in consciousness, which they see involving a new story of who we as humans are in the context of a continuing unfolding over some 13.7 billion years. Our species' time on Earth has been minuscule, as we've recently learned. Only now are we absorbing how precarious our place may be, 7 billion strong and multiplying fast. The U.S. cabinet and its key environmental positions will soon be entrusted to men with a vested interest in the status quo. Some with a history of fighting environmental regulations, others who have advanced disinformation campaigns to confound the issues, discredit science and scientists, and disable democratic decision-making by promoting ignorance, and fear. Fear is paralyzing, but hope liberates. Hope resides in the human spirit, in our ability to feel, to pay attention, to comprehend, and from there to act. Hope resides in the fabric of our relationships, fueling curiosity and compassion. Hope is an act of creation, an act of connection, an act of courage to imagine new ways of seeing and being in the world. Already, 350.org has announced plans for another People's Climate March in April of this year. The water protectors are standing firm at Standing Rock. This Saturday, hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million women and their allies in Washington and around the world will be rallying in support of values for which they intend to fight. We intend to fight peacefully, but no less fiercely. There's even this one close to home. Solidarity fortifies courage and uplifts the heart. So I leave you now with our question to live into the future. How will you guard your spirits in the uncertain times ahead? Meanwhile, I'll guide my spirit in part in solidarity with you and your vital work. You notice there's now a tree growing on my first slide. May your work be fulfilling and fruitful in a culture of emergent innovation, bringing you rich and durable connections and discoveries that are beautiful and new. So thanks so much for having me here and hearing me out. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to interacting with you as the day progresses.
Diana, thank you so much. Thank you for speaking to our minds, and thank you for speaking to our hearts. We're actually a little behind, but I think it was such an important talk. I would just like to open this for a moment to see if there are a couple of people who want to ask a question to Diana. Desiree.
I was hoping that you'd run for office. I actually have a deep feeling that in order for us to make things better, I think a lot of us actually need to get into elected offices. I think we really do. I think a lot of scientists and people who think like we do really need to get out there and so that we can elect you. So can you run for office, please, anytime soon?
Thank you. I think, unfortunately, I'm past my sell-by date on that, but I agree with you completely. And one of the tragedies of what happened to Hillary Clinton is how completely heartbreaking it was to watch her be turned into something that she wasn't, and then how huge a risk other women in particular, but anyone, takes in going into politics these days.
Thank you. That was really inspiring. It really does give us the broader context of what we're doing. So I had a comment and then a question. So one is, I think what Michelle mentioned around the Oxfam recent report is, well, I think there's some hope there, because 4 of those people are very involved with philanthropy. So we're talking about the 8 richest people in the world actually have incomes that equal, yes, 3.6, equal to the lowest 3.6 billion people in the world, which is half the world's population. But we can turn to those people and say, what can you do that is transformative with us, given that we have to transcend governments, use that corporate capitalistic model and turn it on its head. So that's something to consider. But the other question I had to ask you is, I would also wonder what the role of global population growth is going to play on all of these issues as well.
Right. A very big role. It's clearly one of the really serious, troubling realities that if we get up to 10 million, it's just unimaginable. We're already using, one of the estimates is we're using the equivalent of 1.5 Earths already in the resources that we're requiring just to maintain our standard of living across the globe. And then as more people are lifted up, as they must be, out of poverty, and then more people are born. It's a huge problem. If you have time, it's a big read, but it's a really, really thoughtful report, this commission report from the Rockefeller Foundation and The Lancet sort of massive report making the case for this notion of planetary health, does a wonderful job of kind of pulling together all the pieces and doing it in a matrix that makes very good sense and summarizing huge amounts of research. But they very much emphasize population growth. That's a critical variable that's driving this. They say, you know, technology and and overconsumption and these factors that are driving it, but population growth is clearly one of them. And you know, we in the first world are in this awkward position. In the 70s, I worked for Planned Parenthood. In those days, it was zero population growth and the population bomb and all of that. And we actually had a bumper sticker that said, if you can imagine, trouble parking, support Planned Parenthood. And then it became really clear that that wasn't the message that Planned Parenthood needed to be disseminating. And so there, you know, there's obviously all kinds of moral dilemmas here, but it's critical. Thank you.